Welcome to MSL Stories. Friends, if you don't mind, please subscribe to my channel. I have a dream of 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. Let's start the story. I'm 35, a project architect for a well-regarded firm in Atlanta. My work often demands precision, structure, and most importantly, attention to detail. I never thought these same skills would be the ones to dismantle the world I thought I knew. It was a warm Wednesday afternoon, and I was on my way to pick up some things from a store across town. I usually went to the neighborhood store closer to home, but today I'd made a detour after a last-minute client call kept me on the line longer than expected. As I parked, I noticed a familiar figure stepping out of a car just a few spaces away. There was Madison, my wife, laughing as she closed the passenger door of a sleek black sedan. I recognized her smile immediately, one I hadn't seen in a while. The man behind the wheel was a stranger. Madison's face froze as soon as she spotted me. Her laughter faded, replaced by a wide-eyed look of panic. Without missing a beat, I started walking toward her, my heartbeat racing as thoughts rushed through my mind. She stepped back, her hands clasping tightly over her purse as she forced a smile. "Lucas, what are you doing here?" she asked, a hint of nervousness creeping into her voice. Before I could answer, the man in the driver's seat got out, casually sauntering over to stand beside her, an air of nonchalance in his stance. "Hey," he said, looking me up and down with a smirk. "Who's this?" He glanced at Madison. "You didn't tell me you'd be meeting someone here." My eyes flickered to Madison, whose forced smile had vanished completely. She shot him a quick, almost pleading look, but he was oblivious, looking at me with a raised eyebrow. "Who am I?" I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I'm her husband." His face fell, the smirk vanishing in an instant as he processed my words. Madison had told him nothing of our marriage, her carefully constructed lie unraveling in front of both of us. For a moment, we all stood there in silence, each one of us reeling from the unexpected collision of our worlds. And that was the first of many realizations to come, the beginning of everything falling apart. As we stood there, the weight of what I'd stumbled upon began to settle in. Madison, my wife of nearly 6 years, had woven an entire second life out of my sight. She was someone I thought I knew, someone I believed I shared a life with. But the way she looked at me now, the silence thick between us, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an innocent friendship. Madison was always the outgoing one between us, the person who could light up any room. She worked as a marketing manager at a popular design firm downtown. She had a knack for conversation, the kind of charm that drew people in, something I'd always loved about her. About a year ago, she'd announced she was cutting back on her hours, just trying to take some time for myself, she'd said, focusing on self-care and resetting my priorities. I'd thought nothing of it. I was busy with work, and honestly, I admired that she was taking steps to manage her own well-being. The man standing next to her, now looking utterly blindsided, introduced himself with a strained voice. "I'm Alex," he stammered. "I didn't know she was married." His face told the rest of the story. He looked just as hurt as I felt, and that told me he wasn't complicit in this mess. I could tell he believed he was in an exclusive relationship with her, just like I had. I locked eyes with Madison, searching for some sign of remorse, maybe even guilt, but she looked away, her hands fidgeting as she held onto her purse, eyes darting anywhere but toward me or Alex. That was when I knew this went deeper than I'd wanted to admit. She'd been leading this life for a long time, balancing between two men who both thought they were hers alone. "Lucas," she finally said, barely above a whisper, "can we talk about this later?" But there was no later to discuss. The damage was already done. I didn't know every detail, but I had enough to understand that this wasn't something I'd ignore or overlook. I'd already seen too much. I couldn't simply walk away and pretend that none of this had happened. No, if anything, this revelation left me with only one course of action: find out everything. Because if Madison was capable of lying so effortlessly, I needed to know just how deep her betrayal ran. Over the next few days, I slipped into a state of hyper-focus, replaying every moment of our relationship, every strange inconsistency, every gap in her stories. The more I thought about it, the more signs I saw in retrospect. Her new hobby classes, the long weekends with friends, the work calls at odd hours. All the pieces started to connect, pointing to a pattern I'd been too busy, or maybe too trusting, to see. When she finally came home after our confrontation in the parking lot, Madison barely looked me in the eyes. She moved through the house as if it was foreign to her, a place she could no longer call home. I didn't confront her immediately, instead watching her every move, silently observing her reactions. It was like studying a stranger, looking for traces of the person I once knew. My mind started working, calculating the next steps. I wasn't about to let this slide. I was going to unravel every lie, expose every hidden truth. Madison had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences. But this time, I wasn't the one on the sidelines, the trusting partner oblivious to what was happening behind my back. No, I was about to become the architect of her downfall, and I had no intention of stopping until every piece of her carefully constructed double life lay in ruins. That night, after Madison had fallen asleep on the far side of the bed, I sat up, staring into the darkness, the wheels in my mind turning. I knew I had to go deeper, to understand how long this had been going on and just how much of my life had been built on lies. This wasn't something I could rush or approach impulsively. I needed to move carefully, uncovering each piece of her deception with precision. This was a puzzle, and every small piece mattered. I started with the small things. Madison had always been meticulous about her phone. I'd never thought much of it before, but now it was painfully clear. She was always guarding it, never leaving it in the same room unattended. I waited until she was sound asleep, breathing deeply, then reached over and carefully lifted her phone. My pulse quickened as I typed in the passcode, one I'd memorized from glancing at her fingers over the years. My suspicions were confirmed the moment I opened her messages. There were hidden conversations under fake contact names, Sarah and Linda, names that, until now, I had no reason to question. But reading through them, it became clear these were not friends or colleagues. They were messages from Alex, filled with inside jokes, plans, and intimate exchanges. It didn't stop there. I scrolled through her emails and noticed receipts for hotel stays, new restaurants, and tickets to places we'd never visited together. Each line of text felt like a knife. Madison had even kept a second social media account, a private profile where she posted photos with Alex, smiling and happy, a life in which I did not exist. It was surreal, a whole second reality that she had carefully built, hiding it just out of my reach. I'd always been thorough and methodical in my work, and I used those same skills to piece together every part of her deception. I spent days gathering information, pulling together proof from her accounts, taking screenshots, and logging her location history. I unearthed old texts, timestamps, and messages spanning the past 2 years. As I looked through it all, I was overwhelmed with a combination of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Madison hadn't just lied. She'd split her life into 2 worlds, choosing to keep me in the dark the entire time. As my investigation continued, I decided to confront Alex. He was as much a victim of Madison's lies as I was, and I knew he'd be able to give me answers that Madison wouldn't. I reached out anonymously, arranging a meeting in a quiet coffee shop across town. He showed up looking cautious, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. When he recognized me from the parking lot encounter, he looked like he wanted to turn and leave, but I raised a hand, signaling for him to stay. "Alex," I started, my voice low, keeping my emotions steady. "I'm not here to blame you. Madison lied to both of us." He sat down slowly, the tension evident in his posture. "I had no idea she was married," he said, his voice raw. "She told me she'd been single for years." For the next hour, we exchanged information, each new piece adding to the extent of Madison's deceit. He explained how they'd met at a gallery event, how she'd charmed him with her charisma and wit. He'd thought he'd found someone real, someone who understood him. As he talked, I could see his own devastation, the way he'd been hurt by her just as I had. Madison had built an entire life with him, even introducing him to her family, all under the guise of being a committed single woman. I could see the hurt in his eyes as he pieced together how thoroughly she'd deceived him, just as she'd deceived me. Alex and I left that coffee shop with a silent understanding, bonded by a mutual sense of betrayal and anger. Madison had played us both, and now she would face the consequences of her actions. We agreed to stay in touch, to help each other uncover any remaining secrets she had hidden. I sensed that he wanted some form of justice as well, and I knew we could work together to ensure that Madison's betrayal didn't stay buried. After that meeting, I doubled down on my investigation, leaving no stone unturned. I wanted to understand the extent of the lie she had built, to know every last detail of the person she had become behind my back. I wanted her to know that I was aware of every moment, every deceitful word, and every false promise. By the time I finished gathering everything, I knew I had all the proof I needed. Now, It was time to plan my next steps. Madison had made her choices, and now she would pay the price for them. This was no longer about pain or betrayal. It was about justice, and I was going to ensure that every lie she'd ever told would come back to haunt her. With all the evidence in my hands, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I'd spent enough time grappling with the shock and the hurt. Now, I was ready to take action. Madison had spun a web of deceit, hurting not just me but everyone around her, and she would finally feel the consequences of her betrayal. The plan started taking shape in my mind, each detail more defined as I went over the information I'd gathered. Every lie Madison had told, every moment she'd split between her lives, it was all going to come back to her piece by piece. First, I needed to gather allies. Alex was already on board, and though I hadn't known him before this, I trusted him enough to know he wouldn't back out. He'd been hurt, blindsided by the same woman who'd betrayed me, and he wanted justice as much as I did. Together, we made a pact. We'd expose her lies in a way she couldn't escape. The first step was to compile everything into a single, indisputable narrative. I created a file, meticulously detailing every encounter and lie, linking text messages, emails, and receipts. I organized everything chronologically, painting a picture so clear that even Madison wouldn't be able to deny it. I made sure to include screenshots of our own lives, moments that she had erased or rewritten to suit her story. If she was going to lie to everyone she knew, then the least I could do was show them the truth. Next, I decided to target her professionally. Madison's job as a marketing manager was her pride. She'd built a respectable career, made connections, and spent years developing her image as a trustworthy and competent professional. But with the evidence I had, that image would crumble. I drafted an anonymous email to her firm, attaching key pieces of evidence that showed how she'd used her reduced hours, not for self-care, but to manage her second life. Her bosses needed to know what kind of person they were dealing with. I wasn't asking for anything specific, just that they be aware of what was happening. I left the decision in their hands, knowing that her actions spoke louder than any words I could write. After that, I turned my attention to her social circle. Madison had always been the one with the larger friend group, a network she'd maintained since college. They were people who saw her as a genuine, loyal friend, the kind of person who would always have their back. So, using my newly crafted document, I created a short, anonymous account of her lies, attaching just enough evidence to make sure they would see her true character. I sent it out to her closest friends, each one getting a slightly different version so that the story wouldn't feel like some mass accusation. Instead, it would feel personal, targeted. The goal was to make sure she could never weave her way out of the truth. Finally, I prepared for the confrontation. This was going to be the most personal part of the plan, one that I had rehearsed in my mind dozens of times. Madison didn't know that I'd been gathering information, that I'd met with Alex, or that I was fully aware of the extent of her lies. As far as she was concerned, I'd been distant, quiet. She might have thought I was in denial, that I would forgive her as I had so many small things before. But this was different. This time, she would have no idea what was coming. The day of the confrontation arrived, and I made sure everything was ready. I'd taken some time off work, preparing myself mentally, rehearsing the words I'd say to her. That morning, Madison walked into the kitchen, greeted me with a tentative smile as if nothing had happened. I let her believe in her lie one last time, just for a moment. Once she sat down with her coffee, I placed a printed version of the document in front of her. She looked at the stack of papers, her face contorting with confusion, then fear as she began to flip through them. There was no need for me to speak yet. I could see the dawning realization in her eyes as she scanned each page, recognizing pieces of her life laid bare in front of her. The things she thought she'd hidden perfectly now looked back at her in black and white. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, her mouth open, but no words came out. "Madison," I said, my voice calm but unwavering, "I know everything, every single detail. There's nothing left to hide." She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "No excuses, no lies. You made this choice, and now you'll live with the consequences." Her face contorted with emotions, shock, guilt, and finally desperation. "Lucas, please let me explain," she stammered. "Explain what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "How you've been lying to me, to Alex, and to everyone else for years? How you managed to hide an entire relationship? Madison, I don't think there's anything left to explain." I watched as she crumbled, her words dissolving into apologies, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. But there was no remorse in her eyes, only fear. She was afraid of losing her comfortable life, the security I'd provided her, not truly sorry for what she'd done. Finally, I slid the divorce papers across the table. "Sign them," I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And I don't want to see or hear from you again. We're done." With shaking hands, she picked up the pen, her face flushed with shame as she signed. I gathered the papers, stood up, and left without another word, a calm satisfaction settling over me. But I wasn't finished yet. By that evening, the emails had been sent. Her professional reputation was at risk, and her friends knew the truth. I'd given her the chance to come clean, to make things right. But she'd chosen deception. Now her entire world was unraveling in a way she never anticipated, and for the first time since discovering her lies, I felt truly free. Leaving that kitchen, divorce papers in hand, was only the beginning. Madison had signed, her face drained of color, yet somehow still refusing to acknowledge the gravity of what she'd done. I knew that for her, the consequences had only just begun. A few days later, I received a message from Alex. He'd been stunned by our coffee shop meeting, but now he was ready to play his part. Alex was as invested in this reckoning as I was, maybe even more. Madison had promised him things, weaving dreams and future plans, painting herself as the faithful, loving partner she never was. His anger had transformed into determination, and he was ready to ensure her downfall was as public as her betrayal was private. Together, we launched a multi-layered plan that would bring every part of her deception into the light. We began with her professional world. Madison's firm had built her reputation on integrity and client trust. She was a senior manager who interacted with high-profile clients, maintaining an image of stability and professionalism. The anonymous email I'd sent had made its way to her boss's inbox, accompanied by clear evidence of her long absences, the strange receipts and dates that aligned with her outings with Alex. The firm's partners, known for valuing transparency, took the information seriously. I didn't hear anything directly from Madison, but I knew the fallout had begun. Alex kept tabs on her social circle, where the rumors had already started to spread. Friends she'd known for years began to question her, to doubt her explanations. She had few people left to turn to. Those friends who'd once seen her as reliable and trustworthy now regarded her with suspicion. Every lie unraveled one after another, each more humiliating than the last. But it wasn't enough for Madison just to face her friends' judgment. I wanted her to experience the isolation she'd inflicted on me. Madison had kept her world split between two lives, shielded by lies. Now, she would have to confront the reality of her choices. A week later, I saw her by chance as I walked into a local cafe. She sat alone in the corner, her face hidden beneath dark glasses, staring blankly at her phone. I approached quietly, not out of sympathy, but out of a strange curiosity to see her reaction. She looked up and her face registered shock and for a brief second a flicker of hope that I might reconsider. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice wavering. "Please, can we talk?" "There's nothing left to discuss, Madison," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "You made your choices. Now you live with them." The look in her eyes told me everything. She'd finally realized the full extent of her actions, but I wasn't there to console her. She was on her own, stripped of the comforts she'd taken for granted. With Alex's help, her story continued to circulate. Her firm conducted a discreet investigation, and although they couldn't formally reprimand her, the gossip in her office made her days unbearable. Every whispered word, every sidelong glance chipped away at her carefully curated image. Her family, initially supportive, grew distant as her lies became impossible to deny. In time, Madison was forced to quit her job, her once promising career in ruins. She'd spent years building her reputation, yet it took only a few carefully timed truths to undo it all. As for me, I moved forward. The day our divorce was finalized, I felt a weight lift. Madison's betrayal no longer haunted me. Her web of lies had fallen apart, each thread severed by her own hand. She was left with the reality she'd tried to escape, while I'd found my own peace. In the end, Madison got what she'd deserved, a life built on deception now exposed for all to see. And I walked away, knowing that justice had been served. No regrets, no lingering doubts, just a clean break and the satisfaction of finally being free. The day our divorce was finalized, I felt an overwhelming sense of release. There were no fireworks, no shouting matches, just a few quiet signatures in a dull courthouse. Madison barely looked at me as she signed her name, her expression a mask of defeat and bitterness. Her once bright eyes, always alight with schemes and plans, were now dulled. The reality of her choices had finally sunk in, and as she handed the papers back, I felt a finality that was unexpectedly peaceful. After leaving the courthouse, I walked out without so much as a backward glance. My new beginning had already begun the moment I'd exposed her lies, and this day merely marked the official end of the life we once shared. I was free from the deceit, the constant worry, the need to look over my shoulder. The best part was that I didn't have to force myself to forget or forgive. I'd simply let go, severing myself from her in every way possible. Madison, however, had no escape from her actions. Her professional connections had withered, her circle of friends had shrunk, and every place we'd shared memories was now a reminder of what she'd lost. I knew she'd wanted to reach out to me a few times. There'd been unread messages and missed calls, each one more desperate than the last, but I never responded. She'd made her choice, and now she'd live with it, alone. For the first time in years, I could focus on myself. I poured my energy into my work, finding a renewed sense of satisfaction in my projects. Friends, family, even colleagues began to notice the change, a lightness in me that hadn't been there before. I could see new possibilities ahead, relationships built on honesty and trust, free from the toxic undertones Madison had brought into my life. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. I reconnected with people, reclaimed old hobbies, and even took a few trips I'd long dreamed of but never had the time for. I invested in myself, not out of revenge, but out of a sense of newfound freedom. Madison's betrayal no longer weighed on me. Her lies no longer held any power over me. As for Madison, she remained in the city for a while, perhaps hoping for a chance to redeem herself in the eyes of those who once trusted her. But the damage had been done, and her reputation, her social circle, her job prospects, all of it had shattered in the wake of her deceit. In time, I heard through mutual friends that she'd left town, looking to start over somewhere where people didn't know her story. And that was fine with me. I had no need for closure or reconciliation. My life was no longer connected to hers. I had finally let go of her betrayal, moved beyond the need to dwell on what had happened. My future, for the first time in years, felt like it was truly mine. And that was the best revenge of all, living my life on my own terms, free from the shadows she'd cast over it, with no looking back. Months passed, and with each one, my life felt more like my own. The ties I'd once had with Madison were severed, her presence fading until she was just a memory, a reminder of a life I had outgrown. I had no lingering regrets, no remnants of resentment or bitterness. Instead, I had the satisfaction of having confronted the truth and emerged from it with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. One evening, as I walked through a park where Madison and I had spent countless afternoons, I paused to look around, surprised by how little sadness I felt. The memories of our life together no longer haunted me. In their place were thoughts of my future, of all the things I could now pursue without any fear of betrayal lurking in the background. It was a future I could walk into with confidence, no longer shaped by lies or held back by someone else's choices. The journey had been painful, raw, but ultimately liberating. I'd learned to let go of what I couldn't control, to release the anger that had once consumed me, and to rebuild myself from the ground up. I found myself connecting with people in ways I hadn't before, valuing honesty and trust above everything else, appreciating the simplicity of a life lived openly and authentically. For Madison, wherever she was, I felt nothing but indifference. She'd taken herself out of my life the moment she'd chosen her lies over our relationship, and that had been the greatest gift she could unknowingly give me. In exposing her, I hadn't just broken her web of deceit, I'd freed myself from its trap as well. In time, I met people who brought genuine joy into my life, friendships built on real foundations. I moved forward, not just as a man who had been hurt and healed, but as someone who now embraced the strength and resilience he'd gained through it all. Madison's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything I knew, but as I walked forward, my footsteps lighter than they'd been in years, I realized it had only been the beginning of something far greater, a life that was finally my own. Thank you, friends,